So when we met, you told me that one of the benefits of an elected public defender is that you are answerable to your constituents as opposed to the person that appoints you. And yet, despite the history of how the elected office came about, there are no other elected public defenders in California, and very few in the whole of the United States, as you said. Would you, if you could, change that to make the public defender more accountable to the electorate?
I guess it depends on who you talk to and where you're running. People often say, well, if you're running for public defender in Orange County, because it's a much more conservative county, that it would be harder to get a good public defender, that they would not want to elect a public defender who was going to fight against the powers that be. If you think about it, the public defender is the only agency that has the responsibility of keeping judges honest, keeping prosecutors honest, and not to say that we always do a good job of that. It's very easy for public defenders, to be, sort of brought into the fold and not to object. But I mean, just like I was in court a couple of weeks ago, you might have read about this story in the paper, but one of my deputies came up to me and said, oh, there's a witness sign-in sheet in court, and this is where, witnesses who are going to testify sign in. And in one column, they had the name of the witness, and the other, they had the phone number, and the third column, it said bad guy, for the name of the defendant in the case. And so when I saw that, I was like, whoa. And, and obviously someone's trying to be funny, but I brought it to the judge's attention, and the judge was just like, hey, this is just a joke, can't you take it as a joke? And two witnesses had complained about it when they were signing in, saying, what is this? And the district attorney, of course, denied it, and then there was an intern who worked for the district attorney, she denied it as well. And I tried to raise an objection, the judge wouldn't hear it, because he said, we can't prove who did this. Well, I talked to somebody who saw the DA's intern with the list passing it around, so I brought that back to the judge's attention, and the judge was just furious at me. He just said, leave this alone, why are you trying to bring this up? I said, well, you at least ask her whether or not she created this list. So he asked her, she said no. And he just didn't want to have anything with it. Well, it turned out that she did create that list, and she lied about it. Because and how did we find that out? I went to the media. I got the list out, and it made international news for some reason. It was just kind of a weird story about bad guys, but somehow the media picked up on it, and they ended up writing a story about it. So that's a really small example of something that you would bring out, but it still affects the integrity of the justice system, because if you allow people just to refer to the defendant as a bad guy, irrespective of whether they think he actually is a bad guy or not, that runs against our system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have many questions about your public defender role, but I also want to ask you, before we turn it over to everyone else to ask their questions, about your filmmaking, because that's quite a different role. You are public defender by day, filmmaker by night. Like, how did all of that come about?
Yeah, it's actually similar, because as a trial lawyer, you start with sort of your theme of your case. This is a case about, and you test that against witnesses, and sort of that's what you do with documentary filmmaking, right? You talk to your subjects. You make a film and you think, wow, the premise of this film, like when I made The Slanted Screen, which is a film about Asian Americans in Hollywood, my premise of the film was like, Hollywood is racist, and that's why you have these racist portrayals of Asian Americans. Well, when I tested that, I found out that there was a silent, film star named Sessue Hayakawa who, was even bigger than Rudolph Valentino. There was another actor named James Shigeta who, in the 60s and 70s, started movies with Elvis Presley and was a star in his own right. And I didn't know that. So you kind of test it, through that process, and you get to meet people. Like I met James Shigeta. I got to meet a lot of the actors just by asking them about their stories. And the reason I made that film, I was just really interested in how Asian actors in particular balanced having to play these very, negative, sometimes menial roles, playing waiters and laundrymen, and at the same time had to justify this in their community. So that's how the film came about. And of course, I didn't know anything about filmmaking, so it took me like 5 years to make the film. And I finally learned how to hire a good crew and put the story together. But once you have your interviews, and it's not like making Star Wars; these are very small films. You put your interviews together and you tell your story, you weave it together, and you try to tell it in a compelling way. And with the slanted screen, my goal was to try to get it shown in Hollywood. And so after I made the film, we did the film festival circuit, which is a lot of fun. You get to show it at film festivals, and you have to enter them, but there's 1 million film festivals out there, and some will give you a chance. And then I premiered it at the Motion Picture Academy, which is the home of the Oscars, to 1,000 producers and directors in Hollywood. And that's really why I tried to make the film, to try to change people's perceptions about Asians in film. And then from there, I had made sort of the theater version, and I tried to get it with PBS. PBS is the biggest public broadcasting distribution network in the United States, and they told me, "Oh, this is, you're not going to be able to put on PBS. You'd have to rewrite it. You'd have to do this. You have to do that. You have to get a new narrator." And I said, "I'll do it." And so I got a grant, and I got to work with an Emmy Award-winning writer, a new editor, and so we kind of revisioned the film, and then we got it shown on national PBS, and then from there we got it shown in 9 or 10 different countries, from China to Israel, in different languages. So that was cool. And so I just saw film as a greater way that we could get our message out there. So our most recent film is a film called Racial Facial, which is an 8-minute film. You can take one to show at your school. But we wanted to create a film that we could show in the school about the history of racism that's only in 8 minutes, because we know that people's attention spans are limited. And so, we've been showing this film all over the country, and we've shown it to thousands of students already. So that was sort of my goal in trying to make films. But I don't know if I'll make any more. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to do it for a living.
Yeah, so you're trying to change people's perceptions and educate them, and racial inequality, and then, I'm going to talk about 2 big elephants in the room. Income inequality. Those are 2 almost seemingly intractable issues, perhaps certainly income inequality getting worse. And there's one person that normally comes to Fireside Chat who couldn't come today, and he wanted me to ask a question by proxy, which was, if you're a tenant and the building, if the landlord moves in and you're rent controlled, and I'm not going to do a good job of asking his question, but essentially, if you get forced out in a rent controlled space, do you see a lot of that? Do you defend those people? What is your take on it? Yeah. What are your general thoughts on income inequality in San Francisco and how that's changing the city?
Yeah. Some people say that in order to get a free lawyer, you have to be charged with a crime, which is true. Because public defenders only represent people who are charged with crimes. So if you're getting kicked out of your home, if you're fighting a child custody action and a divorce, you're not going to have a right to a lawyer. And so you can lose your kids and not have legal representation. So there is a whole movement now called the Civil Gideon, named after the Gideon case, where the Supreme Court said you have a right to a lawyer in a criminal case, where they're really pushing to advance this. I've been involved in efforts to get more landlord-tenant lawyers and also immigration lawyers for children. Right? There are thousands of children who are being held in immigration facilities, some of them alone, because they don't have lawyers to represent them. And so we really push to try to get lawyers for people who need it. But when you talk about income equality and access to the legal system, if you can't afford a lawyer, if you don't have the means to have someone represent you, even in something as important as child custody, right? That's whether or not your kid's going to be taken away from you. That's a scary thing, and it's something that needs to change. And in some places, like New York, 2 years ago, created an initiative where anyone who is detained and is an immigrant, right? Because if you're here and they find that you overstayed your visa, and or that you for some reason should be deported from the country, they will take you into custody, and you will be there as long as it takes before they figure out what to do to you. Some people are there for years, but New York has an initiative where they've now provided universal representation to anyone who needs it. So we're trying to move towards that in San Francisco. But as you know, it's expensive. It costs money to provide this kind of service to people. But nonetheless, we think that it's important.
Yeah. So at this point, I would like to turn the questions over to the audience. I know we have a couple of attorneys in the audience.
Well, we could all go swimming in your pool.
Or we could all go swimming and ask you questions as we're swimming around. You first, Jeff. So I think, put your hand up if you live in San Francisco, because I think about 50% of the people here live in San Francisco. And look around, you guys, because maybe next time you can carpool. But of course, all of us visit San Francisco too, who live down here on the peninsula. But please jump in with questions and raise your hand if you have a question. Jim.
Okay, I think you've actually indirectly answered this, but do you believe that it should be policy, or at least not against the policy, for your attorneys to try cases in the media?
That's a good question. Jim and I were talking earlier because he reads the Chronicle and the Examiner. He knows all of the intricate political battles in San Francisco. And he was saying that how he does read about our office. And we're very aggressive. I actually have a communications person, and we put out a press release every time we win a case. And people often say, well, why do you do that? You're trying to brag, or you're trying to say, oh, we got this criminal off. But the reality is that you always hear when a person's arrested. You never hear what happens afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so, if a person is acquitted, I feel that they have a right to have their name cleared. And so if so-and-so was charged with a crime and was found not guilty, then people should be told about it in some way, shape, or form. I also think that it's important for potential jurors. My sister-in-law just served on a jury, right, or close to it. And it's important that they have, a sense of what goes on in the system. And certainly there's TV, right? You can watch everything from The Good Wife to, other TV shows, Law and Order. But that's really, a sensationalized version of what happens. In reality, the justice system is a lot slower, it's a lot more painful. And, unlike a criminal trial that on TV lasts for 10 minutes, it can last years. So I feel that we have an obligation to inform the public. We do a Justice Summit every year where we televise on SF.gov TV, if you ever watch that, a 5-hour summit on issues pertaining to criminal justice. I had my own TV show called Justice Now, where I'd bring on guests to talk about body cameras and use of force and things like that. And most of my counterparts would not think about doing that, Jim, because they would not put themselves up for that kind of scrutiny. Not that I'm brave or anything, I'm probably brash, but I really believe that I have a duty to represent our constituent, which are poor people charged with crime. And so when there are issues that involve that, there was a case in the newspaper last week where I commented a lot on, of a San Francisco supervisor who had his cell phone stolen, right? He was walking up the street and someone stole his cell phone, and then he convinced that person, it was a woman, to accompany him to an ATM so he could give her $200 to buy back his cell phone. Well, she was then charged with not only cell phone robbery, which is what the crime was, but also kidnapping for the purpose of ransom, and that's a life offense. And so there's a whole debate in the paper about overcharging and whether or not she was overcharged because A, he was a supervisor, B, he was white and she was black. And of course, you read the comments on SF Gate and people are coming from, all different points of view on that. But the reality is that if I don't speak up for her or her position, no one else will. And often we do have to take unpopular positions. My chief attorney, Matt Gonzalez, who also almost became mayor of San Francisco,
I remember.
much closer than I did, is representing a Mexican immigrant who's charged with discharging a gun that he found on the wharf in Cape killed Kate Steinle. It was a horrible tragedy. He's charged with murder, and it's ignited, right, this whole debate over undocumented immigrants, and whether or not he should have been released in San Francisco, and whether the sheriff's department erred in releasing him rather than sending him back to Mexico, and all these other issues that are even being talked about by the presidential candidates. But again, who's going to speak for him? We speak for him, and it's a very unpopular position to have at times, but that's why we do what we do.